As the hippies move back into their parents' basements, the Mohawk warriors have taken over the Occupy Toronto protests. Get ready for an urban Oka tonight on The Source. You know, the Occupy Toronto protest is just a few blocks from our TV studio, and I pass by it all the time. It's been pretty empty these past weeks. They've got a lot of tents up, but they're empty. They're like flamingo lawn ornaments or political lawn signs. They're just for show. When I visited the squatters first a few weeks ago, it was clear that most of the protesters there went home at night when the media wasn't there to notice because they wanted to sleep in comfortable beds and to have hot showers and have mom do their laundry. Only a few genuinely homeless people stayed there full time, people who were on the streets long before Canada's labour unions decided to copycat the U.S. Occupy Wall Street protests. And the genuinely homeless will still be there once the professional protesters have moved on. It's sad, really. I mean, you know, instead of being so self-absorbed and whiny, these protesters could actually be helping the truly needy downtown instead of mimicking them. Now, the whole thing was rather pitiful. I mean, these effete, elitist, rich, spoiled, entitled white kids coming in from the suburbs pretending to find common cause with homeless and disturbed people. Here's some weird video taken by one kid I met down there when some mentally ill protester came into his tent and sniffed his girlfriend's feet. Seriously, look at this. Look, I mean, it goes on. Those are the cops removing the toe sniffer.
Part of the legal observers.
I wouldn't want someone crawling into my tent and sniffing my girlfriend's feet either. But then again, I don't pitch a tent in a downtown city park and invite complete strangers to hang out overnight either. And the shocked tone of the complainer who's holding the video camera tells me that this kid would probably freak out if he ever went camping in the country anyways. I mean, he'd probably call the park ranger if a bunny came by. But my point is this. Look, Canada's protests have been embarrassingly lame, even if they have cost police millions of dollars in overtime. I mean, within a week, Vancouver police had already racked up $500,000 overtime for their Occupy protest. Toronto has refused to release its numbers so far, but it's got to be higher than that. Anyways, without a clear message, the protest attracted a range of nuts, and I mean that scientifically. I mean, in the States, both the Communist Party and the Nazi Party endorsed the Occupy Wall Street protests. When I visited Occupy Toronto, I saw at least 3 people who looked like they had been deinstitutionalized and were living on the streets and had just gravitated to this noisy camp. They were weak and vulnerable. I have no doubt that the unstable woman who was down there was taken advantage of by men in return for them giving her some food or drugs. I mean, compliance and submission to the will of the group was very powerful down there. Even the cult-like way they talk to each other by repeating word for word everything the leader tells them, it's designed to take advantage of the weak. But look, it's getting colder outside, and now that media interest has pretty much tapered off, the only people left besides the truly homeless and mentally ill are the well-paid union organizers and professional protesters of the kind that, you know, choked the streets during the G20 riots. It's sort of over, except for the cleanup of public parks that have been destroyed and littered with human filth and used needles and condoms. So what's next? Well, in the United States, these Occupy protests have decided to stay relevant by turning violent. Here's some footage of riots in Oakland, California this week at their Occupy Oakland protest. As Andrew Breitbart told us on yesterday's show, this is not accidental. This is the next stage of the protests to spark a violent encounter with police in the hopes that the police response will make these protesters look sympathetic and give them political credibility that their own whiny incoherence hasn't given them so far. Now, Canada's Occupy protesters have been relatively crime-free compared to the U.S. protests, where there have been several rapes and many property crimes. But yesterday in Toronto, a big truck pulled up to the public park where these squatters are located and unloaded whole pallets of wood. Seriously, it was like a construction job site with hundreds and hundreds of board feet of plywood being offloaded by a crane. I mean, this was not amateur stuff. Now, none of the peace and women's studies majors at the park have ever held a hammer in their life, so they wouldn't know what to do with the wood. Maybe the labor unions are going to build some sort of permanent slum to replace the tents. But there wasn't just a delivery of construction wood yesterday. A new group of arrivals came through. A group of hard-bitten men dressed in camouflage gear showed up and started camping out too and flying their flags. They call themselves Mohawk Warriors, and they don't believe that the laws of Canada apply to them. Here's one Mohawk warrior named Jason Fleury telling the Sun's Joe Warmington about his plans to have a big public bonfire in the downtown public park. By the way, he was sitting next to a bunch of chopped down trees in a city park that they were going to burn, so the plywood must be for something else. Here's the Mohawk warrior in full camo gear. Look what he has to say.
Yes, if we're doing our religious, a religious practice has been already established in the court, then obviously, that's recognized first. And to have the elders' presence, okay.
He's talking about how this bonfire is going to be a religious practice. I love how he keeps a straight face when he says it's going to be a sacred fire, because he's such a holy, holy man wearing camouflage. So it's not governed by anything like city bylaws. I do appreciate the fact that he made his finger quotes, though. He's got a sense of humor. Imagine if some Christian pastor or priest had said that to the city, that their laws don't apply to his campground and bonfire because it was sacred. I mean, everyone would laugh and the man would be deemed a religious nut and reminded of the separation of church and state. Well, not here, because being exempt from Canadian laws has become a specialty of the Mohawk Warriors. These were the same folks who had a 2-month armed standoff with police and the Canadian Army in Oka, Quebec. Do you remember that? On July 11th, 1990, when Quebec police moved in to shut down an illegal Mohawk barrier, Mohawk Warriors fought back with military-style machine guns. They actually murdered Quebec Police Corporal Marcel Lemay. The police retreated. They abandoned 6 police cars and a bulldozer, which were taken over by the Mohawks, who stole the cars and the bulldozer. There were more riots. 10 RCMP officers were injured. The province called for help, and the Canadian military had to come in. Mohawk Warriors blockaded Montreal's most important bridge, adding hours to hundreds of thousands of commuters. I mean, it was practically a civil war. The war ended after 2 months with a Mohawk victory when the Canadian government surrendered. Corporal LeMay's murderer was never brought to justice. That's the Mohawk Warriors. They conducted another military mission against Canada in the Ontario community of Caledonia in 2006, when they occupied a residential development site, again setting up barricades, harassing and threatening citizens. Now, this time when the police came, they didn't even try to stop the Mohawks. They just stopped the law-abiding community from fighting back. The illegal gun-toting criminals were protected by the cops. Mere taxpayers were the ones driven out. It was clear that the politicians who run the police cared more about avoiding another PR problem like Oka than enforcing the law. In the end, the province of Ontario actually bought the land in question and gave it to the Indians to avoid having to enforce the law, and it paid out $20 million to the law-abiding residents in recognition of them not having protected them. It would be like a group of bank robbers robbing a bank, and when the police showed up, instead of arresting the bank robbers, the police would buy the bank and pay compensation to everyone, like the depositors, and then letting the robbers keep the bank so the cops wouldn't have to do the tough work of enforcing the law. That's exactly what happened in Caledonia. That payoff was announced just 3 months ago. So now the Mohawk Warriors have moved on to their biggest and boldest target yet, downtown Toronto. They watched how these vegetarian hippies managed to stare down Toronto's police, and if these weak, pale, anemic, vegan, suburban, rich kids could occupy a Toronto park illegally, well, why couldn't some hardened Mohawk Warriors? So now the Mohawk Warriors are there. They're planning bonfires. They're wearing camouflage. They brought in building materials, and the police just sit and watch and rack up over time. What's going to happen next? Will they start demanding that passersby now stop at a Mohawk barricade and checkpoint and show their passport? That's what they did at Caledonia and at Oka. Will the Mohawk Warriors block the streets? Well, they did yesterday, or at least other protesters did. They invaded a TD Bank branch and effectively held the staff hostage there. They took over. Again, nothing from the police other than their overtime pay. If you or I want to go to a Toronto park, we have to fill out forms. Forms for a campfire, forms for food, forms for waste management, forms for having banners, forms for handling garbages, forms and permits and fees. I have almost an inch thick of forms. Application for a special event in a city park or facility. You almost need a lawyer to fill it out. This is how much paper you have to fill out to be in a Toronto park. Here's the fee list on the screen right now that you and I have to pay if we want to have an event in a public park in Toronto. Well, first of all, we've got to pay for the cops. If you and I want to have an event, we've got to pay for security, not the left-wing union activists. They were there illegally, not the whiny college kids. They were there illegally. They didn't fill out the paperwork. The Mohawk Warriors saw the police chief's weakness. Saw how the police leadership in this country is becoming a bunch of politically correct social workers who check your race or religion before deciding whether or not they're going to enforce the law. I mean, remember just a couple of years ago, we saw the Tamil extremists block a major Toronto highway called the Don Valley Parkway in 2009. They literally put children on the middle of the highway to stop cars. The cops didn't arrest anyone, and neither did Child Protection Services. These Tamil extremists put their children on the highway. The cops didn't do anything. Then they didn't do anything when their fellow union brothers set up the Occupy Toronto camp, and now they're getting set to do sweet nothing now that the heavy artillery from the Mohawk Warriors moves in. Question: we know that the police won't enforce city bylaws against these illegal squatters. I mean, do you think they'll enforce rules about waste management? But here's a question: do you think they'll enforce the criminal code if Mohawk Warriors set up barricades on the streets and sidewalks in Toronto? Do you think they'll enforce the law if Mohawk Warriors bring their machine guns to downtown Toronto? They didn't in Oka, they didn't in Caledonia. Or do you think they'll pull another Oka and just cut a big check to the criminals and give them the park? Do you think that's impossible? Yeah, that's what they said in Caledonia too.